Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the last panel, this installment of the Engaged Mind series, looking at theological reflection and the limits of politics. The conversation so far, I think, has been outstanding. The papers, questions. I know that personally I've really enjoyed just being here, being present, and interacting with the speakers. I also want to give a thanks to Al McDonald in the McDonald Agape Foundation for hosting this. He makes this possible, and it takes some money to make this stuff happen. So we always want to be grateful for him allowing all this discussion to take place. So this last panel is going to be focused on Professor Elshtain's book, Sovereignty, God, State, and Self, which grew out of her Gifford lectures. And with that, I'll start by introducing Gilbert Meilaender. He's professor of theology at Valparaiso. He got his BA at Concordia Senior College, MDiv at Concordia Seminary in Washington University, and a PhD at Princeton. Before coming to Valparaiso in 1996, Professor Meilaender taught at the University of Virginia. At Oberlin College, he has served on the editorial board and as the associate editor of the Journal of Religious Ethics. He's also served on the editorial board of the Annual of the Society of Christian Ethics and on the editorial advisory board of First Things. His published works fall generally in the area of religious ethics. Most recently, he's edited, together with William, I'm going to get this wrong, Werpehowski, the Oxford Handbook of Theological Ethics. He has a special interest in bioethics and is a fellow of the Hastings Center and has been a member of the President's Council on Bioethics since its inception in January 2002. Most recently, he is the author of Neither Beast Nor God, The Dignity of the Human Person, The Way That Leads There, Augustinian Reflections on the Christian Life, The Freedom of a Christian, Grace, Vocation, and the Meaning of Our Humanity. Sitting to his left is Professor Lisa Sowle Cahill. She is the J. Donald Monan Professor in the Department of Theology at Boston College. Ms. Cahill grew up primarily in Northern Virginia, was educated in California at University of Santa Clara, and earned her master's and PhD right here in the Divinity School. She has been a visiting professor at Georgetown and Yale, and her research interests include history of Christian ethics, New Testament and ethics, Catholic social ethics, feminist theology, and sex and gender ethics, bioethics, ethics of war and peace. She is past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, past president of the Society of Christian Ethics, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she is the recent author of, or not recent, but she is the author of Love Your Enemies, Discipleship, Pacifism, and Just War, Sex, Gender, and Christian Ethics, Family, A Christian Social Perspective, Bioethics and the Common Good, Theological Bioethics, Participation, Justice, and Change, and Genetics, Theology, Ethics, and Interdisciplinary Conversation. And last but not least, who will be chairing this session is Professor Michael Gillespie. Professor and Jerry G. and Patricia Crawford Hubbard Professor of Political Science at Duke University. He did his PhD here at Chicago as well in political science. In 1981, he was research fellow at the Ruhr-Universität Hegel archives in Bochum, Germany, and he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard for his bachelor's. His research interests are in political philosophy and modern continental philosophy, history of political philosophy. He is a Phi Beta Kappa, fellow of the National Humanities Center, Bass Society of Fellows at Duke University, and was awarded the Leo Strauss Award by the American Political Science Association in 1982. He is author of Hegel, Heidegger, and the Ground of History, Nihilism Before Nietzsche, and the Theological Origins of Modernity. He's also co-editor of Nietzsche's New Seas, Explorations in Philosophy, Aesthetics, and Politics, Ratifying the Constitution, and Homo Politicus, Homo Economicus. He has published articles on Montaigne, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and various topics in American political thought, as well as the relation of religion and politics. He's received grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the German Academic Exchange Service, the Templeton Foundation, the Liberty Fund, the Earhart Foundation, and the Smith Foundation. He's director of the Gerst Program in Political, Economic, and Humanistic Studies, and the Duke Program in American Values and Institutions. And I will now turn it over to Professor Gillespie.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I would correct only one thing. I was last and least on this panel, but that's neither here nor there. I was in this lecture room, I think, before this conference the last time over 30 years ago. It was for a lecture at about this time of day, just after lunch. And the lecturer began by announcing that he suffered from narcolepsy, and that if he happened to collapse at the podium, that we shouldn't call EMS, we should just come and wake him up. And it was the most awake audience that I have ever seen. So I will tell you that I'm slightly narcoleptic, and that if I pass out, if that doesn't work, I've always found this room somewhat vertiginous. I keep wondering what holds the angels up. Is it divine grace, and will God change His mind at some point when I'm standing under one of them? So if you need some anxiety to keep you awake, that's another opportunity. The topic of our panel is Jean's book on sovereignty, which she gave first as the Gifford Lectures. And let me just remind you a little bit about what that means as a measure of Jean herself. Just a selection of the Gifford lecturers: Hosea Royce, William James, Henri Bergson, Henry James, John Dewey, Etienne Gilson, Albert Schweitzer, Karl Barth, Niebuhr, Niels Bohr, Michael Polanyi, Paul Tillich, Werner Heisenberg, Karl von Weizsäcker, Raymond Aron, Hannah Arendt, Iris Murdoch, Paul Ricoeur, Alistair McIntyre, and Charles Taylor, just to name a few. If I could slightly misquote one of Jean's favorite movies that she mentioned in the conversation, not only could she have been a contender, she was a contender in this group, and that's something that we should all aspire to, and we should all be thankful, as I am, to know Jean and to be a friend of Jean's so many years. I first met Jean when she came down to give a lecture at Duke. Was invited down by Women's Studies in the early 1980s, and I went to her lecture. I think it was on the family. There were maybe 200 people in the room. Jean was given 15 minutes to make a presentation, and then they had an epidemiologist, radical feminist, criticize her for about an hour afterwards. And I watched Jean sit there the whole time. The entire, I think with the exception of me, probably the whole audience was out for blood. And when the person stopped, Jean said, "Well, I have 17 points to make." Point 1, boom. Point 2, boom. Point 3, boom. Point 4, I'll save point 4 for later. That's more important. It was I think the greatest example of intellectual and moral courage that I've ever seen in academic life. And I knew from that point on there was no one that I wanted more as a friend than Jean. And Jean's courage, both as a I think goes to the heart of the fact that she's both a warrior and an explorer. And she's someone who has never hesitated to take on what both Bacon and Nietzsche called the idols of the age. And I think first and foremost among them in her Gifford lectures, the idea of the modern state and the modern individual as radically individualized, but in both cases, and to point us towards a more communitarian foundation. We're going to discuss that. Before we do that, I just want to read a selection from Tennyson's Ulysses, which it seems to me is particularly appropriate for Jean. And as some of you will know who've read this poem, it's about an old Achilles who is sort of lying on his bed, looking out from at his ship that sits at the harbor. It's evening, and he's contemplating one last voyage. And it ends with these words: "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset, and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now the strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." I can't think of a poem that better describes Jean in my mind. And so in this last panel, we're going to talk about the state, and we'll start with Gil.
Thank you. I was a little concerned when Daniel began this session by saying the discussion so far has been pretty good. Had a kind of ominous ring to it, I thought. But I'm pleased to be here nonetheless, and happy to be here on this occasion engaging with the mind of Elshtain. I don't know for sure, but I may be the only person here who has actually made one particular kind of contribution to Jean over the years. That is that I taught a son of hers when he was in college, and I think he's turning out okay. So I'm happy for that. Honesty requires, though, that I begin with an admission that may sort of undercut a great deal of what is to follow. The admission is this, that I have no idea how the modern period emerged from the medieval. And since Jean Elshtain explicitly states in her Gifford lectures that she is using the concept of sovereignty to rethink the manner in which modernity emerged from disintegrating medieval structures, and since she develops that thesis with considerable learning and in considerable detail, there's a lot in her account that I don't think I can judiciously evaluate. Were I more confident of my ability to chart the course of several centuries of development, no doubt I would, like almost all right-thinking people today, point an accusing finger or two at William of Ockham and his Franciscan predecessor, Scotus. That seems to be the thing to do, and so I know I should do it if I knew enough to do it. But since I lack confidence to do that, I'm going to take my own idiosyncratic way into her Gifford lectures. In the preface to Augustine and the Limits of Politics, which was published in 1995, more than a decade prior to the Sovereignty book, Elshtain depicted herself as wandering the footpath that ambles from Wittenberg to Rome, not knowing whether I will ever see Rome, reverse direction and return to Wittenberg, or simply meander ongoingly in between. This path has, of course, become rather well-worn in recent years, and I have to say often for quite good reasons. Nevertheless, to arrive finally at Rome, fulfilling and satisfying as that may be, can obscure some things that we should not forget. Tracing the history of sacral kingship, Francis Oakley observes that although the modern era has seen increased belief in limited government and the importance of individual consent, Even as late as the beginning of the First World War, most European states remained monarchical. Relatively few of those monarchies, of course, survived the two world wars of the 20th century, and those that remained often did so only as weakened and desacralized shadows of their former selves. There was, however, an exception. If, Oakley writes, one stands well back and views the royal scene from afar, the one case where a monarchy can be seen to have gained from the 19th century to the present in both power and prestige would appear to be that of the papacy. And again, he says, though it would doubtless try to shrug off the designation, it remains the case that the papacy, which 1,000 years ago launched a frontal assault on the sacral pretensions of the German emperors, still stands out in solitary splendor today as itself the last of the truly great sacral monarchies. Now, that observation is not intended either by Oakley or by me in quoting him as what might once have been called an anti-papist remark, sort of thing that my Lutheran forebears were unjustly accused of making. On the contrary, I think, and I hope I'm not wrong, I think that it helps us to understand something that is going on in Jean's thinking. Oakley may overstate his case, I'm not sure, but it does seem that Elshtain suspects that a genuinely pluralistic society today requires the sacral monarchy of the papacy. That, at least, is the moral of her story as I read it. I'm going to try to examine her story in three stages. First, I want to just think through a little bit about what I take to be the basic narrative at work in Sovereignty. Second, there are a few questions I have about the structure and implications of that narrative. I'm actually only going to deal with one of them here for reasons of time. And then last, I think there are a few larger theological themes that are worth taking up. And again, I'm going to take up just one of them here in order to explore some limits to sovereignty, both political and personal. So first then, just a word about the narrative. Once upon a time, that is to say in medieval times, regnum and sacerdotium, each a form of God's government of human life, were set over against each other as competing jurisdictions. But, Elshtain says, as God moved from suffusing the whole to taking up residence on the edge or margin of things, at least institutionally speaking, regnum did not recede in tandem with sacerdotium. On the contrary, the human longing for transcendence that never goes away was, she says, simply relocated in earthly matters, and the sovereign state emerged. Now, how should one respond to a story that depicts sovereign states beginning to free themselves of countervailing jurisdictions? As she tells us in a footnote to Sovereignty, and I looked at the footnotes, Jean, she is essentially, she says, she describes herself as essentially a counterpuncher, and actually not just sort of slight left jab, I don't think either. Counterpunchers are, I suspect, congenital pluralists. By that I mean that for them our concerns must be shaped by our circumstances, and positions needing defense at one point in time may need criticism at another. You have to counterpunch according to your circumstances. And at least in our time and place, over against that modern sovereign state which seeks to absorb all the sacredness that once checked it in medieval times, some countervailing authority or competing jurisdiction is greatly needed, as is nicely illustrated by the recent struggle over attempts to compel churches to fund as healthcare activities they believe to be morally wrong, an issue that was taken up by Melissa Rogers this morning. In the absence, Jean writes, of strong formative institutions other than the state, it will be very difficult over time to sustain civic freedom. A fragmented and increasingly debilitated collection of small Protestant churches will not fill the bill for that. Hence, if the Roman Catholic Church did not exist, we would have to invent it. Fortunately for Elshtain, it does exist, and although she does not depict it as a sacral monarchy in the way Oakley does, its presence is, I think, essential to her hopes for a truly pluralistic society. One of the accounts given to explain the rise of modern sovereign absolutism, an account that Elshtain characterizes as at least partially accurate, is that the fragmentation of many little principalities in the late medieval period produced a need for sovereign states to maintain order. Likewise, the fragmentation of Protestant bodies within the United States makes Rome appealing to all counterpunchers. to all who recognize the need for a sacral power set over against the awesome majesty of the modern state. Only that will make genuine pluralism possible. Rather than posing some kind of theocratic danger, therefore, the existence of Rome as that standing alternative authority is the chief bulwark of private conscience. Something like that is what I take Jean Elshtain to be thinking. I'm not 100% sure I'm right, but that's my read of the story. Now, I hope this account of her aim is at least partially on target, because it helps to explain the kind of pluralism whose diminishment concerns her, namely a pluralism in which institutionalized religious authority is powerful enough to withstand the tendency toward absolutism in modern political sovereigns. That's what I take to be sort of the thrust of the story. Now, that story then raises various kinds of questions. I want to raise ask one question about sort of the implications of the story. And you could say that this question can be formulated in one word, whither. That is to say, sort of where do we go from here if this is the story? Or more particularly, where should the church go from here? And I realize that this question actually connects to things that Nigel Bigger had to say yesterday and that Robin Lovin had to say today, though they were going in somewhat different directions in what they had to say about it. But compare Jean's Gifford lectures to those of Alistair MacIntyre, published as 3 rival versions of Moral Enquiry. His prescription for our ills directs Christians to look to their own resources, chiefly St. Thomas, and to focus on the character of their own communities. Elshtain is rather more eclectic. Bonhoeffer sits comfortably beside Camus, and her prescriptions seem to be directed at least as much to the political communities we inhabit as they are to any distinctively ecclesiastical community. Now, is that good or bad? Is it wise or foolish? And how do we make such choices? To my mind, at least, those are open questions. I'm not sure what the right answer to give is, and I would like to be clearer what Elshtain thinks about them. I'm not altogether clear, at least from the Sovereignty book. Her narrative moves from the medieval period to the modern. And while it is no doubt impossible to date such periods definitively, Joseph Pieper once suggested that because of its special symbolic significance, we might take the year 529 AD as the beginning of the medieval period. In that year, the same year in which the Platonic Academy that had existed in Athens for 900 years was closed by the Christian Emperor Justinian, St. Benedict founded Monte Cassino. At roughly the same historical moment, Boethius died. Boethius had hoped that his philosophic work could be done in the court of the German ruler, Theodoric. That hope obviously proved to be mistaken. But his younger contemporary, Cassiodorus, did not make the same mistake. Leaving his position in the court, he, like Benedict, founded a monastery. And, Joseph Pieper writes, for almost 1,000 years to come, Boethius remained the last layman in the history of European philosophy. Pieper also suggests that we consider as a symbol for the end of that medieval period the day when William of Ockham, so he got Ockham in the story, the day when William of Ockham reversed the direction of movement and, fearing the fate of Boethius, fled the cloister, preferring to live at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. And from that time, Pieper says, philosophy once again took up its residence in the world. Now, the question, or at least a question, raised for me by Jean's Gifford lectures is whether that continues to be a good place to reside and do that sort of work. Drawing on Trinitarian imagery, she argues that we live what she calls in and through concrete levels of being that reach out toward a universal community corresponding to a God who is not limited by boundaries. Acknowledging that the most important institution for early Christians was the church, and drawing on Augustine's image of Christians as pilgrims, she herself is concerned that these Augustinian pilgrims not, as she says, not flee into a realm at least theoretically removed from the vortex of social and political life. She may be right, I don't know. But the picture of sovereign rulers and sovereign selves that she paints in the book might at least make us wonder how receptive they will be to her Christian vision. And that, it seems to me, a question that can use some direct address. That leads me then to the last thing I want to do, to take up one theological issue there. I actually have another in the longer version of this, but one theological issue that I think is worth thinking about in connection with her story, a story that focuses our attention on the relation between God, state, and self in the discussion of sovereignty. And I want to think about whether we really need something from that medieval world, now lost, that moved into modernity. It would no doubt be Aquinas, not Occam, on Jean's story. Do we need something from there to resist the absolutist pretensions of modern sovereigns, or might there be other ways to go about doing that? And so I don't know if I'm questioning her story. I want to supplement her story, at least in some ways. In relation to our world, the God who exists as three persons mutually indwelling each other is still one and is named as Creator. And so no matter how often we emphasize the relation of the three persons, and relationality language is pretty important at some places in the sovereignty book, no matter how much we emphasize that, it still remains true that this God is one, and I think that complicates the account that she gives, or at least we should extend the account in certain ways. She herself recognizes that, she says, and this is a quote, she recognizes that the genealogy of the concept of sovereignty is nested in the powerful and pervasive construction of God's sovereign dominion, force, and will over what would have remained a formless void had he not exercised his omnipotent volition. And although she commends a God of reason and love rather than unbounded will, this transcendent creator that I just read you her description of, this transcendent creator is not, as she knows, a character appearing only in a post-Occamite world. Only with great difficulty did ancient Israel overcome tendencies all around them to identify gods with particular places or with the cycles of nature. And as Israel did so, the transcendence of God was gradually sharpened and clarified. And this powerful creator is not just a source from which emerges the concept of sovereignty, but is simultaneously one who limits sovereigns, who desacralizes both the natural world and political society. I think that complicates the account of sovereignty that Elshtain gives, for it suggests that a state's struggle for a sound sovereignty unmatched by any countervailing jurisdiction is not just a story of the movement from medieval to modern. I don't think that's a complete story, nor the movement from Aquinas to Occam or anything like that. It is instead, or additionally, rooted more generally in the way Christians picture the relation of God to the world. Thus, for example, whereas Elshtain characterizes the idea of divine right monarchy as an early modern invention, Oakley calls it ultimately pagan in its presuppositions and ancient in its provenance. Hence, our story is not just one of modern political sovereigns setting themselves up in the image of an Occamite God unchecked by any countervailing authority. It is a longer and ongoing story of the biblical God who created the world out of nothing and whose ends political sovereigns must finally serve. And to remind them of that, we may need St. Thomas less than we need the Bible, or at least we might think about that possibility. Whatever our account of the rise of modern political sovereigns, and I already said that, confessed my ignorance on the matter, Christians have good theological reason to deflate their sacral pretensions and to defend whatever countervailing jurisdictions may seem helpful in that project, whether those countervailing jurisdictions originate in Wittenberg, in Rome, in Geneva, in Providence, or even, I'm not sure of this, Salt Lake City. For the God that Christians worship, whether they kneel beside St. Thomas or beside William of Ockham, or maybe even just beside Martin Luther, that God is one who, in order to use political sovereigns as his servant for our good, drains all ultimacy from them. Now, I'm aware that the story that I myself have been telling, no doubt in quite abbreviated form, is no sure thing and has its own difficulties and will produce certain difficulties, in fact. For example, on the account that I have given, the God of Israel whom Christians worship desacralizes not only society and its sovereigns, but also nature. This is not unproblematic, though it is also one of the sources of modern science, the blessings of which we all enjoy. The God of Israel creates an ordered world, but a contingent one. There is order in nature to be discovered, but it has to be discovered. It need not have been ordered as it is. And having discovered it, we may then manipulate it in lots of ways, some of them fruitful and creative, others debilitating and destructive. That is what science as a human project does. The world comes to be thought of as a machine whose workings we seek to discover, to fix when needed, and perhaps even to improve. If, like St. Thomas, we think of the world's order as participating in some mysterious way in the reason of God, we may be drawn to think of the world somewhat less as a machine and somewhat more as a living organism. If, unchastened by the plot of Elshtain's story, we think of the world's order as simply imposed by the divine commander, the image of a machine may have more appeal for us. But in either case, we need not suppose that piety demands that we never put nature to the test, never seek to direct it, and even to master it. If so, however, then our difficulties are going to go fairly deep. I said that the God whom Christians worship desacralizes not only society, but also nature. So far, maybe so good, though I understand that some will get off that train already. But at least in the view of some, we have to go on to add not only nature, but also human nature. And if so, then, my account would actually become part of the problem that Elshtain confronts in her concluding chapters on self-sovereignty. In The Abolition of Man, one of the most incisive accounts of this problem, C.S. Lewis writes that there are progressions in which the last step is sui generis, and in which to go the whole way is to undo all the labor of your previous journey. That is to say, our mastery and manipulation of nature has required that we see it not as a living organism participating in a cosmic divine order, but as something like an object, a machine to be tinkered with. Now, though, and this is, I think, a large part of Elshtain's concern in the last part of the book, now we have begun to make humanity itself a natural object, available for manipulation in answer to our boundless and endless desires. She and I are agreed that at least many aspects of this project should be resisted, and even, not to put too fine a point upon it, condemned. But on what ground? Consider her narrative. What resources for resistance really is her narrative offering? I'm not altogether sure of the answer to that question, though she'll probably clarify it for me. But as best I can tell, her move is once again an appeal to relationality, language that I said before is important in the book. The self I have in mind, she writes, seeks meaning and dignity and finds a measure of both, not in total liberation from nature, not in some utopian attunement and at oneness with nature, but rather in growing to become a full person according to our human natures. And that nature, she says, is intrinsically social. We are created to love and to be loved. Now, with none of that do I wish to disagree. Indeed, there's an insight there that I think merits our attention. In That Hideous Strength, one of C.S. Lewis's space fantasies, and actually sort of a companion piece to The Abolition of Man, a guy named William Hingest, who is himself a scientist, says, "I happen to believe that you can't study men, you can only get to know them, which is quite a different thing." That is to say, if the persons whom we want to know and understand, if those persons are unrepeatabilities, language that actually I develop more in a section of this paper that I haven't bothered you with, but if persons are unrepeatabilities, distinguished not by their capacities, but by their relations, and that, of course, is what the Athanasian Creed is all about, if that's what persons are, then getting to know them is the right way to honor and acknowledge them. So there is something important in Elshtain's appeal to our intrinsically social nature in order to oppose unending manipulation of human beings in answer to our desires. But I'm just not sure that relationality language alone is sufficient. I think that actually there's a deeper theological ground at work that's not really unpacked in sovereignty, and this may have something to do with those several questions about what the best strategy is that Nigel Bigger and Robin Lovin and so forth were taking up. But if we think about that deeper ground, perhaps we can say one thing that is beyond what she says, and something that is more definite, and something that's available for learning both in Wittenberg and in Rome, because it's shared by both. The triune God lives not only ad intra, but also ad extra, as the theologians say. That is, the divine life includes not only the mystery of God's inmost life, those inner Trinitarian relations, but also God's missions to the world, as they're called. Chief among these is the incarnation of the Son in Jesus of Nazareth, in and through which our human nature is, so Christians believe, taken up into his person. This means that every person is made to share in the enjoyment of God. Each is a possible future companion in beatitude. To quote Lewis once more, there are no ordinary people. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. The human person is not, therefore, a proper object of our mastery or manipulation. Quite obviously, that general statement will need to be refined and made more precise in countless instances, but I think it's the theological premise that underlies Elshtain's rejection of so much that we have learned and are learning to do to others in the name of our sovereign selfhood. There's more than just a general claim about social origins of the self at work. There is a great chasm fixed, finally, between mastery of nature and mastery of human nature. The curtain will one day fall on the natural world, and God, so Christians believe, will create new heavens and a new earth. But that new world will not be one for which new persons need to be created. It will be a world inhabited by the persons we live with and know here and now. And recalling Jean's short little afterword in the Sovereignty book, we will not then, I think, want to be known as people who consigned to the shadows outside our circle of concern those with empty pockets. Thank you.
So, thank you. I have to say, like Professor Gillespie, that it's great fun and also a great honor to be back here in the Divinity School, and especially to be responding to Jean's Gifford lectures. But I better get my glasses. I have to admit, as I have already to our respondent, that I really know next to nothing about the historical developments regarding sovereignty that she treats in her book. But I will say that there's some things in that book that I share with Professor Elshtain, and probably primary among them is the defense of moral realism and a shared human nature, and therefore, at least in my language, some sort of a revised natural law. But there are actually three main points on which I would like to engage this book, and a little bit more generally Professor Elshtain's work in general. The first is moral realism. The defense of moral realism, I agree, is essential to the efforts toward global justice and human rights. Because as Jean says, justice and human rights require an order of justice that transcends any cultural system and that can stand in judgment of the libido dominandi. The second issue is sovereignty. And I must say I recognize the ideologies of autonomous power or will that the book Sovereignty is talking about. But I don't ultimately think that they are the main problem for theological ethics or social ethics today. And instead, I want to identify a perception of powerlessness, of being at the mercy of forces one can't control, as a bigger challenge for Christian ethics and an ethics of justice overall. And the third point is Augustine. When I read various works of Jean's, I see two Augustines in play. And I wound up wondering whether perhaps this is also because there are two Augustines in contention in Augustine's own writings. And I know that this was discussed a little bit yesterday, and I certainly am not foolish enough to try to settle that, but to try to settle the debate, but I'm going to just put out maybe some advantages of each of these Augustines. And ultimately, I think the Augustine of sovereignty is much more sanguine about political justice than the Augustine who appears in some of Jean's earlier works. Before developing these points, let me situate myself a little bit in relation to Jean Elshtain's project. I'm not a political theorist or a historian. I'm a theologian, indeed a Catholic feminist theologian and a social ethicist with strong ecumenical interests. Much of my work is inspired by the New Testament and work on early Christianity, but also by appropriations of Aquinas, probably more than of Augustine, by Catholic social teaching, and by liberation theology's preferential option for the poor, which of course since Vatican II has become part of Catholic social teaching. In addition, I've been involved for several years with something called the Catholic Peace Building Network, which was founded by the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame and Catholic Relief Services. And this experience has helped me to understand both the human suffering caused by war and the depth and extent of the human hunger for peaceful social life. Through the Catholic Peace Building Network, theologians like myself were brought together with peace workers in 3 conferences, in Mindanao, the Philippines, in Bujumbura, Burundi, and in Bogota, Colombia. And in those meetings, I learned much more deeply that societal violence is usually protracted and intractable, that the majority of those killed are civilians, that neither states nor the so-called international community nor the UN has much power to end violence, that peace building must be conducted within conditions of violence and not only afterwards, and that women are the most frequent targets of violence as well as the most pervasive and persistent workers for peace. And yet, despite these very discouraging factors, it is still necessary, and people do work confidently toward the reestablishment of social institutions and toward just and stable societies. Jean Elshtain has likewise over the years maintained a strong interest in war, peace, and just war, as well as more recently in the rebuilding of societies after conflict. She repudiates, as I do also, the realist idea that war knows no law save that of force. But it is no simple matter to articulate the content of the moral laws governing use of force in the international arena, and it's even more difficult to understand the nature of the authority or authorities that could govern or do govern the moral use of military power or the rebuilding of societies. So with that as a background, where I am coming from, the lens through which I am seeing this, let me expand on my 3 points about moral realism, the possibility of sovereignty today, and the real Augustine. But I'm going to begin with sovereignty because that's the major topic of the book. The thesis of sovereignty, God, state, and self, is that both divine and state sovereignty changed in meaning as a consequence of the replacement of medieval theology by nominalism. And Gil's already talked about that a little bit. As Professor Elshtain puts it, the accent shifted from sovereign God as the apogee of reason and love, a God bound to and by his loving creation, to God as force and will, a God less accessible to us and less trustworthy. The shift in conceptions of political or state authority runs parallel from the idea that earthly dominion is about use or justice and governed by law to a more absolutist view of political authority. These developments have serious consequences for the individual as a moral agent. Let me just give you 4 quotes from Sovereignty, God, State, and Self. 1, as sovereign state is to sovereign God, so sovereign selves are to sovereign states. 2, as God wills and the state wills, so selves will. We are willful, we make demands, we have wants, but the we is an aggregate of I's. 3, the self stands alone, sans any mutually constitutive relationship to the world. And 4th, the language of conquest, control over, complete self-ownership, tests of self-sovereignty prevails. In concluding chapters of the book that deal in part with genetics, abortion, and what Jean calls radical feminism, Elshtain offers up some extreme outcomes of such a view of the self. For example, the feminist philosopher Alison Jagger is quoted as saying in 1983 that if new birth technologies could enable women to inseminate one another or men to carry pregnancies and lactate, then there could be, quote, a substantial reduction in the social domination of women by men and an increase in women's control over their bodies and their lives. As I very well also recall, the ethics of abortion was addressed philosophically in those years with analogies to far-fetched cases of people seeds, famous violinists, and minimally decent Samaritans, all of which made the fact that a pregnant woman had not chosen to get pregnant the key on which analysis should turn. Like Jean Elshtain, I thought and still think that the fact that an unborn child is entirely dependent on its mother and intimately biologically related to her is also a source of moral obligation. Yet it has been a long time since we have seen a truly sovereign self, given the worldwide economic situation, the prevalence of conflict and violence around the world, which is mostly intrastate and affects civilians, and from the philosophical side, the many theories of the self as constructed or as a product of sociobiological drives. Even in the case of abortion, as Carol Gilligan has shown, concrete women in the existential situation of a problem pregnancy do not follow the script of the sovereign self. Figuring more prominently are relationships, obligations to others, and the harm to others beyond the self that a given decision will cause. Feminism does not come off well in sovereignty. Yet feminists and feminist theologians often call attention to human relationality. In fact, feminist theologians have been out ahead of the pack in challenging a bioethical ethic of choice, especially market choice and consumer choice, in favor of greater access to health resources by the global poor, instead of the development and marketing of genetic tests and pharmacogenomics to profitable first world consumers. I do, of course, recognize and reject the I'm all about me and I'm in control mentality that Elshtain categorizes under Augustine's view of sin as self-love. Surely this attitude is a huge factor in the moral outlook of the 20% that controls 80% of the world's income and of the 1% that since 2007 has controlled over a fifth of American income. Yet I question whether our 21st century world offers anything near a majority of people what sovereignty describes as a vast arena within which many projects and forms of an absolute self, a law unto himself or herself, beckon. For one, the worldwide economic recession has taken a serious bite out of individual self-determination. The last I checked, the unemployment rate in this country was stagnating at about 8.3%. I myself have 5 underemployed children, 3 of whom have returned to live at home. Meanwhile, you laugh. Someday your turn may come. Meanwhile, double the number of Americans over 65 are working compared to 15 years ago. Attaining any meaningful degree of self-sovereignty has become a struggle, and not only for the mentally and physically disabled for whom Jean Elshtain rightly urges our empathy. We should also not think that while meaningful life direction choices may be few and far between at the existential level, the philosophers are still carrying on in a liberal dream world where autonomy is king. I need only mention post-Foucault, postmodern, and post-colonial theories, hypotheses of the social construction of the self, post-liberal communitarian ethics a la Alistair MacIntyre, sociobiology and its deterministic philosophical fellow travelers. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has addressed the non-sovereignty of the self repeatedly and at length over a period of decades, primarily in Sources of the Self, The Ethics of Authenticity, and recently A Secular Age, in which the self's identity and vision are highly influenced, if not determined, by the available social imaginary. If we turn our gaze worldwide, we quickly appreciate the prevalence of the powerless self over the sovereign self. According to data released last March by the World Bank, the rate of absolute poverty, people living on less than $1.25 a day, in the developing world fell to 22% in 2008. Yet, despite these advances, there are over 3 billion people now living on less than $2.50 a day, almost half the world's population. And 1 billion are predicted to live still in absolute poverty by 2015. Considering states and their sovereignty, I think of the theories, for example, of Anne Marie Slaughter or the Catholic social ethicist Brian Hare, maintaining that although state sovereignty has not disappeared, it has eroded, with many more transnational entities and networks affecting the internal and external behavior of nation states. According to Slaughter, dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, we are living in a world in which authority in global affairs is not vested exclusively in sovereign states. It is increasingly dispersed as networked authority, shared among disaggregated states that communicate with one another at multiple levels, judiciaries, legislatures, regulatory bodies, and so on, achieving cooperation piecemeal in spheres and layers as states contrive to share power for mutually agreeable ends across borders. Civil society and non-governmental organizations are also active in transnational networks of influence, including some religious organizations like the Roman Catholic Church, truly a transnational network. In this environment, states have to operate just as much reciprocally and cooperatively as through decisions or actions of national governments that set themselves over against other states. There are also cultural reasons why the sovereignty project is not as pervasive worldwide as it may seem to us. Cultures in Africa and Asia, as well as Latin America, are much more communal in nature. As the African saying goes, "I am because we are." So to talk about justice and politics today, we need to look beyond the horizon of our own liberal democracy and its vision of civic virtues, whatever their assets or limits may be. As far as God is concerned, the debate about the nature of divine sovereignty goes back to before Nicaea, with quite a few heresies, in fact, resulting from attempts to make sure that God did not really have to share divine sovereignty with Christ. A model of divine power as kenotic powerlessness is advanced in theologies of the cross across the centuries. A prominent interpretation of the cross today is that it represents not God's judging power and punishing sinners, but God's solidarity with victims and with sinners, whose effect is reconciliation and transformation. What I would really focus on, though, is sovereignty as construed by Jesus' ministry and message of the reign or kingdom of God. Limiting God's power by the natural order of things, as Elshtain recommends, is right and important. But the corporate and political metaphor of the kingdom of God is also a key to the shape of divine sovereignty. Biblical narratives depict Jesus' ministry of the reign or kingdom of God as the revolutionary inclusion in one community of the righteous and the sinner, the elite and the outcast, the beloved and the other. As the chronologically first gospel has it, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." Mark 1:14. Jesus showed the game-changing nature of the politics of the kingdom in multiple parables, such as the Good Samaritan, prodigal son, good shepherd, and his remembered counsel in Matthew 25. "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do for me." Yes, in a fundamental sense, God is sovereign, as Karl Barth so resoundingly reminds us. But in a postmodern and post-colonial vision, God also enters into the sufferings of those who subsist on the underside of history. I was reading this over in the plane this morning and thought, okay, so what? Why does all of that matter? Like, what point are you trying to make here? And I realized that what I wanted to say is that I think the challenge for Christian ethics in today's world is not so much to poke holes in inflated sovereignty, but actually to build up a sense of constructive social agency that remembers Augustinian realism and the need for eschatological hope, but that can also beat back the cynicism and the waves of despair that follow in the wake of political realism and just an acceptance of self-interest as the only important motive of politicians, governments, states, and international alliances. Above all, the we who lives in powerful first world nations, liberal democracies, must remember that when we look at things like humanitarian intervention and torture from the standpoint of those who might actually be the victims of it, the moral situation and the political call are going to seem a bit different. On the topic of moral realism, there is a lot more for me to agree with than to disagree in the book Sovereignty. In this book, Jean Elshtain refers to Augustine in support of moral realism. She says, for example, humans are by nature destined for community and a social compact, respecting all as equal before the law, because human beings, qua human beings, deserve equal moral regard, corresponding to their inalienable dignity. On the basis of human nature as involving embodiment, sociality, and basic equality, again a quote, we look for commonalities and for sources of renewal. In this and in some earlier works, she calls on Augustine. She claims that he backs a naturalistic morality and that includes equal regard. Moreover, she believes that even Augustine would say that fallen nature heeds the call to justice that is embedded in an account of our natures and discerned through our God-given reason. I actually believe that equality or equal regard, which is a premise of moral agency in sovereignty, is a much harder common human value to defend than basic goods related to human beings' embodiment, sociality, and need for cooperative social institutions. So basic goods are pretty much recognized, but that everybody has an equal right to them, equal basic right, that's a harder call to make. I think Gil was actually suggesting some of this when you were talking about persons and saying that the recognition of personhood might ultimately depend on the recognition of the incarnation. So I'm not sure I would go along with that because I'm still with Jean wanting to try to defend it philosophically. I just think it's really hard to do it, and I'm not sure it's possible. I'm not sure there's a knockdown philosophical argument in favor of basic equality. In any event, very few societies today truly and in practice recognize equality as a social norm or give equality secure legal protection. The unequal position of women in virtually every society, including modern societies, including the United States, is but one illustration. Many or most defenses of equality amount more to assertions than to explanations. Perhaps equality is better defended through examples and narratives, maybe not limited to Christian narratives, but we have, for instance, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Other traditions have other narratives, for instance, the young Prince Siddhartha's encounter with human suffering. So I arrive at the question looking at politics then, can equal regard constitute a commonality to guide international affairs if it's not in fact endorsed in practice or given only lip service? Beyond the question of equal regard as an objective value, we have a noetic or epistemological question. Yes, we may agree, or Jean and I may agree, that there is a genuine moral order enshrining non-negotiable dignity, rights, and the common good. But who can and does know that order? Who is motivated to observe it? And this, of course, is where Augustine walks in the door. There are at least two well-developed schools of thought about whether one should emphasize tranquility of order and well-ordered concord in proposing an Augustinian social ethics, or, on the other hand, miserable necessities, the fact that the Romans' virtue was really no better than vice, and that justice and peace require loving God above all as the summum bonum, which very few are given the grace to do. I hear that it was suggested yesterday that perhaps in some of Augustine's letters and sermons, that split may be negotiated. I have not read all those letters and sermons, but I have read some of the work of Robert Dodaro showing that in practice, Augustine appealed to Roman officials and other North African bishops to try to advocate against the death penalty and for justice for the poor and so on. But I still am left wondering whether that practical Augustine can always be reconciled with the political vision that he put out, for example, in the City of God. And I'm not really sure that I want to reconcile the two. Maybe there's something good about having the two Augustines. In any event, I'm not going to be silly enough to try to settle here the question of the real Augustine. I only want to note for us the tonic effect of the more pessimistic Augustine for people like me and other Catholics who come out of the common good tradition but can be a little naive about what we can actually get accomplished. I do not want to give up on working for change, which is where Elshtain's moral realism and an objective value of equal regard are useful. I think that the book Sovereignty does note the less auspicious Augustine, but I do wonder how well he really functions in Elshtain's constructive politics. One example would be when the most powerful nation state is set up as the vindicator of global justice. I wonder whether a really Augustinian view wouldn't be more mindful of sinfulness and the corrupting influence of power, would recommend humility and maybe take a more multilateral approach to such decisions. I wasn't here for Nigel Bigger's paper, but Nigel, I noted well when you mentioned that you admired Tony Blair for telling George Bush that he needed to take the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 before the UN Security Council. And so that doesn't resolve everything. That's not a perfect decision-making body, but at least it's an attempt to put in place something like a touch of checks and balances. When I think back or ponder more extensively the Gifford Lectures' fairly sanguine reading of Augustine as a resource for natural law, for public ethics, and for historical justice, I like to remember also a truly excellent line that occurs in the same book. And that, as many of you I'm sure have read and also recall, on this earth, if the lion lies down with the lamb must be replaced frequently. This other Augustine is treated better, I think, or at least more forthrightly, in Elshtain's earlier book on Augustine, in which he depicts political Augustinianism. So that's Augustine and the Limits of Politics. I'm not sure how much credence you now put in the Augustine that you say you once presented to your students back in the 1970s. Was it just boilerplate, or do you still think it reflects dimensions of the real Augustine? In my opinion, the old class notes were not half bad. They concluded that Augustine, quote, does not believe living in political society transforms or completes our natures. He dissents from strong conceptions of justice. There is a rough and ready justice, to be sure, even in robber bands, but earthly justice is often little more than a principle of retribution, as well as an imperfect sign of our sociality. It doesn't touch on the really important stuff. I still see validity in the question the younger Professor Elshtain then asked of her students. Even though political Augustinianism is not particularly attractive to us, might it not say something true about the human condition nonetheless? I am acutely aware that Augustine is complicated, even ambivalent. There are multiple schools of thought about his politics and his views of justice. I will just offer up one small example to sort of keep on the table the possibility that these two sides are their intention, and they have not, and maybe it's better that they not be, resolved through scholarship. The renowned Augustan scholar Robert Marcus, back in 1970, wrote a famous book called Seculum, in which he maintained that a truly just society is impossible without faith in the God of Christianity and love of that God above all else, possible, of course, only through grace. Over 3 decades later, in 2006, Marcus wrote another book, Christianity and the Secular, defending the autonomy of the secular from a Christian standpoint and giving a more hopeful construal of political justice. I have not read the second book, but I read one reviewer who offered this. The reviewer was Anthony Meredith, and he opined that the second book is, in some ways, a retraction of Marcus's earlier work, since it consists in an appeal to be open to and value the secular. The reviewer, though, expresses his own reservations in a concluding understatement. Whether Augustine would have gone quite as far is not absolutely certain. What is striking to me is that for Augustine, the Romans did not merely have imperfect virtue. They were vicious, seeking glory, honor, and fame. Not just complete or perfect virtue, but any virtue worthy of the name depends on grace for Augustine. And as far as the universal availability of grace is concerned, Augustine is no Karl Rahner. Furthermore, it is seriously questionable whether Augustine thought the prospects for even Christians to achieve political justice to be particularly good. I'm always impressed by the fact that in the same book of the City of God 19, in which Augustine famously holds out the political ideals of tranquility of order and well-ordered concord, he repeats at least half a dozen times that those engaged in politics will unavoidably be entangled in misery, miseries, and miserable necessities. Surely the torturing judge he offers is a highly dubious character. To me, at least, sovereignty, God, state, and self, concludes finally with an enigma about the relevance of Augustine to politics. The last chapter contemplates, quote, the human future. That's part of the title of the last chapter. But the book ends not by imagining what more just national and global government could look like, but with an anecdote about Jean Bethke and the Christian community of L'Arche. Augustine may make, as sovereignty says, universal claims about human dignity and value. But Bethke then warns, one of the dangers in our world is wanting to do big things, heroic things. We are called to do little things lovingly, to work to create community. Where does this then leave politics, political justice, the real place and possibilities of states and of selves as citizens, and the necessary global institutions and actions to preserve peace and avoid war? I don't know the answer to those questions, but I would like to hear more development. In conclusion, then, globally, I think individuals, governments, and civil society experience lack of effective agency rather than sovereignty in remedying the destruction of the environment, genocides, the subordinated status of women, slavery, and human trafficking. In Christian social ethics, the glaring danger is not secular liberal individualism, but retreat into small communities of liturgy, prayer, and shared moral values on the small scale, with resulting abandonment of social and political commitments that were so important to both Augustine and Aquinas, and I would argue so necessary to living out the gospel as the kingdom or reign of God. At the end of the day, we are left, on the one hand, with the confident, outreaching, justice-committed politics of Augustine, Catholic social teaching, and Jean Elshtain, and on the other, the circumspect, church-preferring, dirty hands-washing politics of Augustine, Luther, and also Jean Elshtain. I'm not at all sure that these two can be put together analytically, but I still do believe that they are important and still both rightly operative in Christian politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Your comments were very provocative, and I can't help but note something that Jean may refer to later, that among our current political candidates, we have probably the most pious ticket that has been on the ballot in 100 years, and one of them dismisses 47% of the population for not being sufficiently self-sovereign, and the other gives out copies of Ayn Rand to his office workers. So I think it's just an interesting question of what the connection between self-sovereignty and piety is in that context. Anyway, the main argument of Jean's book rests on the contention that the shared or overlapping notions of sovereignty that characterize the Middle Ages is preferable to the monistic conception of sovereignty that characterizes modernity. She takes the modern notion of sovereignty to include three different aspects: the sovereign God, sovereign state, and a sovereign self. All three, in her view, are ultimately the result of a movement away from the Trinitarian vision that characterized Catholic Christianity from Augustine to Aquinas. The nominalist rejection of this dogmatic Trinitarian vision sowed the seeds of the modern age by propagating the notion of a radically omnipotent God who created the cosmos as he did, not because it was the best or most rational possible world, but simply because he wanted to. To use a technical theological term, he was indifferent. That is to say, he was not guided by any notion of good or evil that transcended his own willing. This new vision of God, in turn, gave birth to visions of the sovereign state as what Hobbes called the mortal God. This state, or Leviathan, was imagined to be beyond good and evil, directed only by its own will, and Jean sees this as a dangerous development that culminates in nihilism in later modernity. Jean argues further that this notion of the state led to the idea of the sovereign individual, exemplified by the Cartesian self that exists as a thinking thing or subject beyond the world of everyday experience. This independence of the self provides a foundation on which to stand, an Archimedean point, as Descartes put it, that makes it possible for human beings to imagine that they can become masters and possessors of nature. That is, that they can literally become God for the natural world. This modern vision of both the state and the self, in Jean's view, is fallacious, rooted in human pride and a sinful desire to rival God. Modernity, in both incarnations, is thus mired in evil. In following this path, modern man thus chooses sin over righteousness and power over love. Both Lisa Cahill and Gil Meilaender are in general agreement with Jean's account of the dangers and ubiquity of sin, and like her, see Augustine's account of the irredeemable sinfulness of human nature as a necessary reminder of and safeguard against the pride that infects us all. Their papers both engage seriously with Jean's work and raise important questions. Gil has several concerns about Jean's argument. First, he asks whether what Jean actually wants is merely a greater role for religion in the public square or something more like a royal role for the papacy to counterbalance the omnipotence of the sovereign state and the belief in the individual self-sufficiency. Such an idea of the papacy, he argues, has dangers of its own that become apparent in the 19th and 20th centuries when the institution in fact became more powerful and centralized. Second, he seems to suggest that there is no obvious role for Protestantism in Jean's institutional account. And finally, third, he argues that Jean's account of the impact of Christianity on human community is underdetermined, pointing particularly to the need to flesh out what she means by her effort to derive the idea of relational politics from the Trinity. Her account, in his view, is not detailed enough to give us a concrete idea of the mechanisms she sees at work here, and thus opens up a wide range of conflicting possible interpretations. To remedy this problem, he believes she needs to pay greater attention to the ways in which religion is fundamentally embedded in the relation of the world and God, and thus to give us a clearer idea of what we might call the metaphysical foundations of her argument. Lisa, like Jean, sees Augustine as a crucial reminder of the constant dangers posed by human pride, and thus as a good antidote to the optimism of later thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas. She does go to some pains, however, to show that there are many developments in the contemporary world and politics that represent countervailing tendencies to the role of the sovereign self and state that Jean describes. In fact, she suggests that these forces have in fact destabilized the sovereign state and threaten individuals in various and profound ways. From her point of view, assigning most of the blame for the nihilistic situation of the contemporary world to the modern notion of sovereignty thus may be exaggerated and misleading. It is important, she insists, to recognize that many human beings are at the mercy of other titanic forces that they themselves cannot control. The criticisms and cautions that Gil and Lisa offer are, to my mind, insightful and important. We should note, however, that they do not deny the importance of Jean's argument, nor do they seriously call into question her central thesis. Their comments are, in fact, generally requests for a more detailed account or further extension of her arguments. That said, to come to terms with Jean's arguments, we need to consider two of the most challenging issues they raise, encapsulated in Gil's suggestion that there is something essentially Catholic and papally royalist about her argument, and Lisa's observation that she has put too much weight on sovereignty and overlooked other factors that are at work in the modern world. In what follows, I want to explore these issues a bit more fully. Jean, like Hannah Arendt and others, is worried about the modern state and the theory of sovereignty that underlies it because of the increasing tendency of the state to eliminate other sources of authority. We typically think of this sweeping role of the sovereign state as culminating in what the 20th century theorists Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski called the totalitarian syndrome, usefully encapsulated in Mussolini's famous statement, quote, "Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state," unquote. This vision of the role of the state characterized fascism and communism in their heyday, and this notion is something that we forget at our peril. In Germany, it was called Gleichschaltung, in the Soviet Union, cleaving to the party line, and in communist China, adopting the people's perspective. It aimed at the elimination of all organizations and associations, including and especially religious institutions, that were not organized and controlled by the state. But were these political movements and attempts to gain total hegemony the inevitable outcome of modernity, or aberrations brought about by war and economic collapse? A variety of thinkers from Horkheimer and Adorno to Arendt and Leo Strauss saw them as the necessary consequence of the founding principles of modernity. Those who sought to deny this claim often tried to explain the extremes that typified these regimes as the result not of modern notions of sovereignty, but as atavistic expressions of earlier authoritarian religious and political cultures in the states in question, summarized in the phrase, "No Luther, no Hitler." While there is undoubtedly some truth in these claims, it would be a mistake to imagine these are dangers only for states with backward cultures. A number of thinkers, often following explicitly or implicitly Tocqueville, have pointed to similar developments in the most advanced democratic regimes as well, suggesting that bureaucratic despotism is a continual danger for all states. The American founders also recognized that it was necessary to develop institutions that would prevent such a consolidation of power in the hands of a monistic state apparatus. These concerns with growing powers of the state have long occupied libertarian thinkers, and most recently manifesting themselves in the Tea Party movement, but such fears extend much more broadly, as is obvious today in debates about the Patriot Act, free speech, gun control, religion, and the state, to take just a few examples. Jean argues that the sovereign state is the principal source of this danger, and that measures such as federalism and or the division of powers and a system of checks and balances may be useful in this context, but that they are ultimately insufficient to check the growth of state power. What we need instead is an equally powerful, independent, and alternative center of authority, such as the papacy once provided. As individuals are reduced to isolated subjects, ever more susceptible to the forces of public opinion and state control, there must be an institutional basis for resistance. This conclusion perhaps explains why Jean gives such an important place to Catholicism in her argument, and places such little hope in the Protestant alternatives. Almost since its inception, Protestantism has been splintered, and as a result lacks the institutional force and authority to challenge the sovereign state. Moreover, mainline Protestantism, beginning from Luther, is generally supported structures of state power. In times of conflict, Protestant churches have thus often proven to be less resistant as institutions to the use of state power to impose tyrannical or totalitarian control. Although many Protestant individuals, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, have exhibited exemplary courage and stand out as beacons of resistance. Even Anabaptists, who are often in principle anti-statist and are thus unwilling to serve in the military or even to take personal injury cases to trial, have remained splintered and thus have been unable to form a common front in opposition to the power of the modern state. The critical question, of course, is whether the sovereign state is as powerful or as unimpeded as Jean suggests. In this context, Lisa's questions about other forces need to be taken seriously and perhaps examined more concretely. Hobbes famously claimed that the most powerful of all human creations was the state, the great Leviathan. There can be little doubt that for most of modernity this was indeed the case. The dominance of the state, however, produced a peace dividend, what Steven Pinker has pointed out in his Better Angels. Insofar as the institutions of the modern state vastly expanded the zone of peace, it made possible an even greater focus on what Hobbes called commodious living. That is, the accumulation and enjoyment of commodities, of wealth, and the well-being that it engenders. In this context, the benefits of trade and increased productivity as the result of the application of modern science and technology, or the process of production, has brought about a level of prosperity unprecedented in human history. This very prosperity, however, has unleashed powers that were hitherto unrecognized. Over time, these powers, particularly of communication and finance, have escaped the authority of the state, taking on a life of their own that challenges and at times undermines the authority of state institutions. Following Lisa's suggestion, it thus seems reasonable to ask whether the power of the state might not be counterbalanced in our time by the power of international economic institutions, including transnational corporations, the World Bank, the IMF, etc. If this is so, then we need to consider the possibility that these powers limit the power of the state in ways analogous to that of the church in the Middle Ages. In considering this question, we also then would need to reflect on the odd relationship of the Christian churches to both the state and international capital in the global arena. Lisa brings this up with her discussion of poverty in the Third World. Here it might be useful to rephrase Gil's question and ask whether a more careful interpretation of the internal economy of the triune God would help us to come to terms with this confrontation. Obviously, the development of modern economic life was deeply impacted by the notion of the sovereign individual that Jean describes. Without such an idea of individuality, the notion of private property, which lies at the heart of the modern market economy, would not make sense. The extent to which such a notion of individuality is constructed on the model of the sovereign state, however, seems to me to be problematic. In fact, such a vision of the individual is already apparent in the work of Petrarch. That is, before the development of the modern sovereign state. It is also clear that the formation of the sovereign individual that Jean so rightly sees as central to modernity owes a great deal to the thought of Luther and Calvin. Indeed, it would not be too far-fetched to suggest that the modern individual is an essentially humanistic or Protestant notion, or even that it is most fully developed in the anti-Trinitarian theology of Servetus, Socinus, and their followers. All of this suggests that the Protestant dissenting thought is more complicit in the development of the modern idea of the individual than Catholicism. This concern seems to lie just beneath the surface of Jean's argument. I do think, however, that we should not therefore conclude that Protestantism has no role to play in providing answers to the dangers of the modern state. In fact, I would like to suggest in this context that at least one Protestant thinker does attempt to moderate the sovereign power of the state. and here I disagree with Jean, I'm thinking here of Hegel, whom Jean characterizes as the preeminent proponent of the deification of the state. It is not hard to see why she makes such an assertion, since Hegel himself ends the philosophy of right with the assertion that the state is the march of God through history, and that the actions of the state are thus to be judged not by Christ in the final hour, but only by world history. It seems that what matters to him is thus not truth, justice, or goodness, but only success. Hegel consequently seems to preach a doctrine that might makes right, and that the foundation of all right is determined only by the ultimately victorious state. This conclusion, however, overlooks Hegel's deeper claims that greater might is always a consequence of greater rationality. That is to say, that states triumph in the long run only because their institutions more fully embody reason and right. The final state for Hegel is thus not the absolutist or totalitarian state that Jean is so rightly concerned about, but the state that sustains and reconciles individual sovereignty, or right, with moral responsibility, family obligations, economic competition in the marketplace, the demands of various sorts of corporations and associations for our loyalty, including churches, the need for defense in a multilateral world, and the importance of collective decision-making on questions of law and public good. It is not that Hegel is negligent of Augustine's concern with pride and evil. It is rather that he, like Goethe, believes that God ultimately turns evil to the service of good and pride to the service of human happiness and well-being. To be sure, he places a hereditary monarch at the pinnacle of the state, but this monarch, as he himself points out, only has the power to dot the I's and cross the T's. This is a communitarian vision that seems in many ways to provide a great deal of what Jean believes is necessary, especially if one recognizes that Hegel asserts that the realm of absolute spirit, including art, religion, and philosophy, transcends and guides the state. The ends of spiritual life are thus coincident with those of the state, not because the state mandates these ends, but because the state has come to accept and embody the ends that religion and philosophy recognize as absolute. Jean's critique of Hegel seems to be motivated by the connection of the Hegelian notion of the state with National Socialism. This connection is certainly not without its merit or defenders. Hegel himself, however, adamantly opposed the romantic nationalism that culminated in National Socialism. Moreover, when Hitler came to power, a noted German jurist correctly remarked that Hegelianism had finally come to an end. What is troubling about Hegel for Jean is thus not so much his thought itself, but the use that it was put to by his followers on both the left and the right. It's often been remarked that the last battle between the left and right Hegelians took place on the plains of Stalingrad. However, if we seek to find a Protestant solution to the problems of the sovereign state that Jean so aptly describes, there is perhaps no better place to begin than with the thought of Hegel, particularly because it recognizes the enormous centrifugal forces that characterize modern economic life and that leave individuals subject not just to factions and self-interested corporations, but also to the seemingly uncontrollable flows of global capital that worry Lisa and many others as well. Martin Heidegger famously remarked in a Spiegel interview that, quote, "only a God can save us," unquote. He therewith abandoned his earlier hopes to overcome nihilism and promote a new beginning through a great act of will. He seems to have ultimately concluded that the path to a new beginning could not rest with human will, since it was exactly such willing that was the core of the modern problem. In the face of this realization, he seems to have retreated into something like an expectant quietism, waiting on God, unable to do or to recommend anything of his own. Seen against this backdrop, we might conclude by asking whether Jean's argument about the sovereign state is meant to motivate us to will something different, or merely to alert us to an ineluctable fate. Should we understand her to be calling us to arms, or raising a banner for us to follow? It hardly seems that this can be the case, since Jean then would be suggesting that we could will our way out of this problem. On the other hand, she does not seem, like Heidegger, to counsel quietism and inaction. She is no fatalist, and she does not suggest that we retreat to the catacombs or go into internal exile until God shows us the way to a new future. What should we then take away from her argument? What finally would she like us to think, to say, and to do? Or to quote Gil's earlier comments, whither from here? All this said, I would not like anyone to conclude that I do not appreciate the depth and profundity of Jean's work, especially as the questions she asks and the claims she makes are central to my work as well. The questions I pose are also questions I ask myself. Jean has given us a profound and synoptic account of the role of will in modern thought and the way in which this idea of will has manifested itself in prevailing notions of sovereignty. She has also courageously pointed out the consequences that this has had for many contemporary problems and conflicts. I know of no one who has been as perspicacious or as comprehensive in the treatment of these topics as Jean. Indeed, the rest of us all are in many respects only laborers in the vineyard that she long since planted and cultivated. It is rather because of the importance and depths of her argument and insights that it is so important that we treat them with the high seriousness and pose the most difficult questions to Jean. Jean, as I said earlier in my introductory remarks, is a warrior. And Nietzsche says, what warrior wants to be spared? Jean is also a friend, and what friend does not want to be pushed by her friends to think more deeply and to be asked to answer the most difficult and challenging questions? Thank you. The floor is open for questions. It looks like we have about 15 minutes.
No, we have time for question and answers, so.
We do have.
We have Q&A. That's right. Well, I don't have. Are you chairing this?
I am chairing this panel.
Yeah, why don't you chair it?
Okay, should we?
I would actually just like to hear Jean Well, I'll make this very brief, which is already a bit of an accomplishment when you're talking about Hegel. And that is that Michael is a much more sophisticated reader of Hegel than I am, I'm sure. And he's quite right. He hit the nail on the head when he said that I'm concerned with the uses to which Hegel's thought has been put by others. One of the questions that I put to students when I teach in the core, which is, I haven't for a while, but in the classics and social thought, is to ask them to imagine a world reconstructed in the way that the theorist suggests, the philosopher commands. What would that world look like? What would it be like to be a citizen of that polity, to be a subject of that particular king, and so on. I run into students who, there are two kinds of extreme responses. One is it's a completely illegitimate to do that. You've got the text here, and it's a kind of pure thing in and of itself, and it's not fair to put certain questions to the theorist over things that he himself was not responsible. He didn't do this, and yet we're making him bear the burden of it. So that's one kind of reaction. And of course, we're not going to make Hegel bear the full burden for the emergence of the kind of statism that was so much part of the backdrop in German politics to Nazism. But is there no connection whatsoever? If people are deeply inspired by, imbued with this thought, there's some kind of connection. And how do we appreciate that and understand that without saying, "Oh, burn this book. It's incendiary. It's dangerous. Let's get rid of it." The other extreme example is, in fact, to saddle the thinker with full responsibility. I think that's happened a bit in some of the recent flurries of excitement about Heidegger. Heidegger is not my kind of thinker particularly, but there have been some events of the last few years that have made me a bit sympathetic, given that there were even calls to have his books removed from the shelves in libraries where you have philosophy, and to put him into some other category altogether because he was so obviously a full, complete, unrepentant Nazi of some sort. So you saddle him with the responsibility for the horror of the regime. That's too extreme an example. So, how does one, or an approach? So how does one weave one's way? If you're thinking of these thinkers in context, and so that's the framework that's always in my mind. And I started out that way in my first book, in Public Man, Private Woman, sort of saying, well, we can read this sort of abstractly, or we can say, gee, what kind of world would it be if the following really pertained? So I think our approaches to Hegel are somewhat different in that regard. And I would certainly defer to Michael on any kind of subtle reading of Hegel's philosophy and metaphysics and so on. But I, at the same time, think that what I have to say about his politics has some merit. And also in the struggle that I talk about early on in discussions of the family and politics, that the way Hegel sets up the struggle for the young man in the family to sort of tear himself away, from the domestic, because that's the only way that he'll be able to be a full citizen. So women remain in the realm of a kind of ethical particularity and can never reach the universal point. But the young man has to be wrenched away so that he can, and then the culmination of that universal ethical point is self-sacrifice in war. It's pressing the political point and the political issue, but not in a narrow way, in a more philosophically rounded way that I approach Hegel or any of these other thinkers. And you're always going to get charged, and it's not, Michael didn't do that, but some have done it, charged with beating up on poor so-and-so. I remember once being, someone was quite agitated because of some of my criticisms of Plato, and went on, and I said, I think Plato will survive. It's not, it's not as if one theorist sort of sitting in her office can destroy Plato, but and you shouldn't just stand silent before these figures. So how do you bring them in and engage them? How do students today do that? And that's what I try to do when I write about them or teach about them. Does that help a little bit?
Jean, can I just in that context come back to Gil's point, which is what role do you see Protestant? You give great weight to Catholicism and the papacy in your account.
I'm sorry, say again.
You give great weight to Catholicism and the papacy.
Yes.
In talking about a counterbalancing force to individualism. Do you see a role or some kind of moral role? In Gil's point, on the road between Wittenberg and Rome, is there anything to be learned in Wittenberg, or are we inevitably headed towards Rome?
Well, no, I'm certainly not inevitably headed that direction, but I think Gil's point is so interesting, and I really need to think about it. because I have a hunch that something like that's probably going on, and I need to. And it seems to me that I need to. Probably, it's a good idea for all of us to once in a while read our own books and try to figure out what we said, what we were trying to say. So I have to think about that. It's, the famous essay by John Courtney Murray on the one and the two, I think and we hold these truths. And it's about the liberty of the church, the freedom of the church, not about, again, individual consciences, and it's talking about institutional freedom and kind of institutional sturdiness that is sufficiently robust it can withstand the onslaught of state power. And it may be that I've overdone it. I mean, it's possible that, the view of state power, but if you're a person my age shaped by the politics of the 20th century, it's hard not to be worried about that issue, and just how much power there is that sort of congealed, coalesced, in the modern state apparatus, even in a liberal democratic society. And what could counterbalance that? What could be a counterweight to that? So I've got to sort that out further. Protestantism is hard. It's hard to say because Protestants long ago stopped trying to speak with one voice or with some kind of unanimity, save of the thinnest kind. You could say, oh, we're for peace, we're against social injustice, but when it comes to grappling with these deeper questions, it would be very difficult, I think, and maybe not so wise to try to force some kind of unity where there just isn't. Such does not exist. So I'd have to think about that some more as well. But at any rate, Gil really, really threw me I don't know what it is, but whatever he threw, I'm going to have to deal with. Yeah. But I thought it was a very interesting observation, Gil, on your part. And I wondered if maybe I had just fallen in love with too many of those movies set in the Middle Ages, or something. Or the recognition when I was doing medieval history, which was my area of concentration as an undergraduate in history. It was a world that was our world, that in the sense that it's the history of the West, but was so deeply unfamiliar, so unlike our world, that it proved exquisitely fascinating, because somehow we came out of that, but this is it was as strange to me as a kid in Colorado as, a Martian. So I think there's that, that lure of that kind of fascination that you don't lose. Some of those early intellectual challenges and loves even, that you're just not going to relinquish them. So the question is, how do you reflect on them critically?
There's a question over there.
I just wanted to push you a little bit. I know you need to think about it more. But with respect to the institutional sturdiness, wasn't it precisely the state churches and the German church and the Roman Catholic Church that capitulated during the Holocaust? And as I've learned from your class, only Bonhoeffer and the Roman church that's trained upon the Word of God was the one that's sort of wily enough to hold that.
Well, one of the dilemmas, obviously, when you think about the politics of the 20th century and state power and resistance to it, is how you sort out moments when, rather than resisting state power, one merged oneself into it, just blended into it, which is certainly what was done by the Deutsche Christen in Germany in World War II, the state Lutheran church, but an immediate alternative structure was born, but it was struggling, and I'm talking about the confessing church, trying to organize some alternative, if you will, and that was bound to be weak given the forces arrayed against it. The Catholic Church in Nazi Germany is a more complicated case. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but that partially escaped the coordination of the Gleichschaltung, the total and complete coordination of all institutions. So they're all Nazified. They're all taken over and sort of renamed and redefined, the youth organizations, the women's organizations, so on and so on. So you ask yourself questions about what would remain upright if the hurricane came? What institutions would be capable of resisting, and in what ways? And that's not such an easy thing to grapple with. And I'm not trying to say that we would ever be in a situation like pre-Nazi Germany, because we won't. I mean, our history is too different. But we are in situations all the time where there are certain forces at work that we don't control, and we recognize that they're at work, and we certainly can't respond to them effectively just as a single individual. So how do you generate institutions and not just movements? So that in the 1960s it was a movement, something that's far more sort of ephemeral. It doesn't have an institutional home. So it comes and it goes very quickly, maybe leaves some legacy behind. But it doesn't last, by definition. It's moving, it's a movement. There's something in Americans about our makeup, the story we tell about ourselves, that is rather resistant to institutions. We have the sense that they're going to, we'll be stymied, we'll be hemmed in. We have to be free and out there and doing what we do. So that anti-institutional bias, and there's been some recent work on this in political science, actually, but the anti-institutional bias, I think, militates against our ability to conceive of institutional possibilities that exist with us now, that are with us now, and that might be generated over time, that would provide for a kind of plurality that I think is the best we can do at this point. You certainly don't want a monistic state or a monistic society of any kind. What kind of plurality? And there, again, if it's not to be just ephemeral and what people are enthused about at any given moment, there has to be some institutional location. And that's probably another reason that the stronger ecclesiology of Catholicism is appealing in this context when you're thinking about these kinds of issues. And interestingly enough, Bonhoeffer said that one of the things he learned going to his own sort of movement on that pathway, Wittenberg and Rome, that it was the ecclesiology that he was drawn to and needed to think more about, and he never got a chance to, obviously. But
can I just say one thing about that to emphasize Jean's point? I sometimes ask my students if they consider themselves to be just, and everybody raises their hand and admits that they're just. And then I ask them, and I know this will be strange to University of Chicago people, but I ask them if they've ever gone to a Duke basketball game and sitting in the crowd seen the referees clearly make a very bad call in favor of Duke, and stood up and said, "Give the ball to the other team," right?
Yeah.
We become without institutions of resistance, it's very difficult for somebody to stand up and say that's wrong, right? Not only, let alone, that's just at a basketball game, let alone in the face of tanks and the SS and everybody else. So my question for Jean was real, whether there's a Protestant, whether there is a more individualistic solution or whether we don't need some institutional safeguards of the kind that she talks about.
But the problem is institutions, religious institutions aren't always institutions of resistance. That's the problem.
That's
like
right.
You were mentioning. I was thinking about this too, and I thought you made a good point, that converged with Jean about religion being an alternate voice.
Yeah.
But is it always, but then you tended to go back and put the emphasis on the medieval institution.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that the answer is always the institution, like the Catholic institution, and not the Protestants.
Right.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
We need institutions of resistance, but they're not always the official religious institutions, although it might be true religion that's resisting, which maybe the institutions have given up on in a certain period.
Although a very brief response to that would be that one of the ways that big institutions that have survived for a long time, one of the ways that they move and change, because they can often seem intractable, is precisely when there's dissent on the outside that takes some kind of institutional form. It's not just a voice here and a voice there, but and that can help things to shift over time.
Just a quick comment on that. Even when an institution like the Roman Catholic Church, which over time has its good moments and its bad moments, I did mean what I said, that I think you can argue that it has been the chief bulwark of private conscience. In fact, its existence in a way, and therefore there is a sense in which the rest of us are parasitic on it. I have to say.
I think that's a very astute insight, and not to recognize that indebtedness, I suppose, is something that one sees certainly in American society.
Yeah, at least it just said it looks better from the outside than the inside. Sometimes. And there's truth to that. At the same time that I say the rest of us are parasitic upon it, I stay outside.
Well, I think
But that could make you a free rider.
It can, I admit it. Yeah,
so
that's right.
you may have to think about that. All right.
So I think we actually are at a breaking point.
Well, actually, we're leading directly into Elshtain's comments.
Okay.
Right.
We're going to remove.
I think actually, I think I was giving my comments then in a way, but I'll come up there.
Well, then they tell me I will get
Me too, so we must have at least, but they say, well, we'll take it. Don't worry.
Whoops. Lost my drink. I'm okay. I just almost dropped my drink. I think I'll sit rather than stand, if that's okay. This isn't going to, I'm not going to spend much time. I've been talking already. But before anything else happens, we have a brief presentation to make. So I will ask Michael to come forward and to do the honors. Is this, yeah. So Michael, if you would please carry on.
Well, just as a thank you to Al McDonald and the McDonald Agape Foundation that has made this entire conference possible, and the 4 conferences actually, with next year being our final one, we have a framed poster of the conference to give to you here. So please join me in thanking. And otherwise, I give it back to Dr. Elshtain.
Al, do you want to say anything? We bring you the microphone? All right. Well, as I indicated, you've been listening to me for the last 15 minutes or so. I did not write up a formal presentation. I wanted to listen to hear what people had to say over the yesterday and today. And as with the first two of these conferences, my initial reaction is just one of humility, of the attention that people have paid to my work and the care with which they've read the texts. And I'm delighted that it seems to be a source of illumination, but also a kind of counterfoil for people and functions in a variety of ways, in part because one of the scholarly life is on some level a kind of lonely life too. I talk about relationality all the time, and I spend a lot of time huddled all by myself with a book, and you don't know what's going to happen with something you've published. Just there it is, and then it goes out into the world and has a life, and you don't know very much about that life unless there's an occasion like this when you say, "Gee, it really did sort of go out there and do some work." It's very hard to understand, or to plumb the depths of the impact that any of this might have. You can see why people love to engage in forms of work or sport or entertainment where there's an immediate payback. A person is performing in the theater, a great performance, and the audience rises to its feet and huzzahs and clapping and so on, and you've done a great night's work. We never know if we've done a great night's work or a great day's work, for sure, because you don't know what's going to happen with what it is that you're doing. One of the things that struck me listening to all the wonderful papers was the fact that I'm preoccupied with certain basic themes, and that comes out again and again. People talk about say, "Oh, you've written about war, and you've written about states, and you've written about popular culture, you've written about the family," and so on and so forth. And for me, they're all part of the same thing. Not that families and war are identical, although some people think they are, but that the basic themes that interest me and entice me are at work in all of these situations, which means that we're coming right down to rock bottom, or as rock bottom as we can do as limited human beings, and that's just to understand who human beings are, what we are as creatures, what we're capable of for good or for ill, and how to do what Augustine enjoined us to do, which is to find a way to create a society where you can reconcile competing human wills, as he put it, so that people don't you sat there, so that people don't tear one another apart. And I think that we know the dangers are lurking. I mean, what would happen if there wasn't what we loosely call law and order? We know what would happen. We see situations like that. We see it now with failed states. What happens when there's no order and no authority in a particular society? It's a terrible thing. And that's why, apropos sovereignty, peoples that don't have a sovereign state want one. That's what they want. You talk to them and they say, well, that's what we need. It's the way you gain recognition in the international world of politics. It's your ticket into the club. You have to be a sovereign state to be a voting member to be a full-fledged voting member of the UN, and so forth. So there are some forms of sovereignty then that are that are simply, one can't think of doing without them. You don't know what would substitute for them, or how one would find some alternative way to order, the world of polities, of multiple polities. So once again, I often find myself in this position. I don't like the alternatives off on the extremes on either side, but some, so you could say I'm in favor of some limited kind of universalism, politically speaking, but don't go all the way with the idea that there is some universal, like Kant, some universal society that can be created if we all have homologous political regimes. At the same time, you want to keep alive that there's enough similarity, that we can create, we can try to judge and assess, as well as create polities that are more kind than cruel, that are sustaining of their population, that I call it, what is the phrase I came up with? Like good enough states, or something minimal, but that's okay. There are millions of people in the world who would take that by comparison to the situations that they're in. So finding that ground where we can coexist with one another, and it's not grand, it's going to be rather humble, but then from that other things can grow, can be built. If you're in a situation of complete breakdown and anarchy, and people don't know if they step out their front door if they'll ever be back in the house and safe again, those situations, Hobbes was right in this, nothing can be built, nothing can be sustained. Human rights becomes a kind of bitter joke. So in the book on sovereignty, I wanted to do the critique that it seemed to me necessary to do, but at the same time not pose, simple alternatives to it, as I don't think there are any at all. And I do know that, again, that those who don't have states want them, given the way the world is organized. The yearning for something other than a particular place called a state goes deep with many, and has been around for a long time, but I think the best we can do at this point is to try to have these sort of good enough states, minimally decent. I think that's the phrase, minimally decent states. And then hope that once one achieves that, which would be an enormous achievement, you could begin to build other institutions and so forth, or you could look to the building of them as something that might be an enduring achievement, rather than an occasional moment when things coalesce, much to everyone's surprise. I guess I should keep talking, shouldn't I? Hold on a second. I also wanted to indicate that one of the things this conference told me, as did the first two, was how fruitful the conversations can be when people share some material and get together for a couple of days to have a dialogue. People from different disciplines who ordinarily wouldn't be talking to one another. Mostly, of course, political science and political theory and theology and ethics in the case of these conferences, and how fruitful those discussions really are, and how rare they are, because most of the time when we go to our professional meetings and so on, it's, you're with your group. But this compels us to speak across these lines of division, of disciplinary division. And I think it's enormously helpful, and focuses our thought in ways that might not otherwise be focused. I really don't have much else to say. I know that some of the graduate students have told me they would like to hear more about, how do you grow up from being a graduate student to being a professor and so on. And maybe we should just organize a session on that here in Swift Hall this fall and go over those issues. How in my generation, what were the issues we faced? How did we see the world? And the very different world that all of you who are graduate students, the very different world you find yourselves in. There are similarities and commonalities, but there are also quite big differences. For one thing, let me just mention one. One is that we were extraordinarily confident. I'm talking about graduate school in the late 60s, early 70s, that there'd be a wonderful job, waiting once you got your PhD, that you wouldn't have any trouble. It might not be the job you really wanted, but it would be a good job somewhere, and then you could go from that to where you really wanted to be if you were good enough, if you published and so on and so forth. And to persevere, as graduate students here in this room do today, to persevere without that assurance and without that conviction, I think is quite brave, because you put in a tremendous amount of time, and it's tremendously expensive, and you don't know at the other end if there's going to be a place for you in the world that you've trained yourself for. So there's a level of anxiety that has to be present that I think was not for us. We were worried about the Vietnam War and about things that were sort of outside in a sense, but not about our own futures all that much. So that would be one, how that affects people when they study, their choice of courses and so on. I don't know. I know it has to, but I would like to hear more about that. That's again a big difference in our respective eras. And there are others, but let me just mention that one. I don't want to take any more of your time. You've heard my name enough for a couple of days, and I just want to again express my gratitude to Michael Le Chevalier and his crack team, who, in fact, I think we should. Really did an extraordinary job, and I'm deeply grateful, because I was missing in action through most of the preparation for this, given some health issues I was dealing with. So I realized at one point I could just relax, because I knew that Michael was going to get the job done. So that's great. That was a great blessing for me, and I thank you so much for it, Michael. And he's already been tapped for next year's conference, so I'm not letting him go. He's been too good to let go. So thank you all so much for these 2 days, and we're going to do something we don't know yet, but I'll be talking to Michael about that and so forth. With the papers, publication possibilities and so on, but none of that's solidified. So I'll just leave it at that. But thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.